Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Puja Mehra.
The latest release of the GDP estimates that showed 23.9% contraction in growth in the 3 months from April to June has set off a great deal of commentary on the health of the economy and the extent of the damage from the COVID crisis and related lockdowns. Most people assume that the estimates imply a fourth of the Indian economy has got wiped out. This is misleading. On Everyday Economics this week, there isn't going to be a guest. Today's episode is about the complex nature of the economic recovery post-COVID and how we still don't have full understanding of the challenges of measuring and lending policy support to the recovery. The first thing to note is that the 24% GDP growth contraction is a preliminary estimate. It will be refined and revised over the next many months in accordance with the standard calendar as more and more information becomes available. Second, what the estimate shows is the impact of the lockdown. As economic activity was brought to a halt, with most non-essential shops, factories, production, transport services, trade, investment and consumption shutting down, the GDP was bound to be lower than in the same months of last year. Since the lockdown was announced in March, the first quarter or the subsequent 3 months saw the strictest lockdown. As the lockdown is unwound and the level of economic activity gradually recovers to normal, GDP will pick up. The question to be concerned about is if the GDP can return to the level it was before the lockdown. Because many businesses have had to pay salaries, rent, water and power bills and other overhead fixed costs despite zero or low sales and revenues, and this is likely to have affected their finances to make them weaker. Many may even have become insolvent. The same is true also for individuals, professionals, self-employed, daily wage earners or salaried. They may be left with stretched or severely strained financial positions. The ability to bounce back to pre-COVID levels of consumption, investment and production may not be possible for a section of the economy. With relief and help, some may be able to return to their feet, but there could be some irreversible permanent damage, the extent of which and the pace at which the rest are able to get back to full speed of economic activity will determine how long the economy will need to bounce back to the pre-COVID level and how robust this recovery will be. Economists have given a variety of projections of how this recovery will take shape. It is fashionable for commentators to employ shapes of alphabets to describe the rebound. A quick dip and equally rapid bounce back of the GDP growth rate, the graph plot with quarters on the horizontal axis and the GDP growth rates on the vertical axis, of which resembles the alphabet V, is called a V-shaped recovery. The optimistic projections are suggesting such a rebound should be expected. The plot for a slower recovery tends to look like a U, making it a U-shaped recovery. On the extreme, a graph for prolonged weakness reminds of the alphabet L. Many projections are also suggesting that the economy may go through such a phase of delayed recovery. Most of the optimistic projections are relying on the rural economy's relative outperformance. Several indicators suggest that the rural economy is showing a recovery already, even as urban India remains sluggish. The reasons for this are that the villages did not face as strict a lockdown as urban India did. Also, much of the meager government relief spending was directed towards the rural economy. The monsoon rains are likely to also have been a positive factor for farm produce, although it remains to be seen what this will do for farm incomes. The proxies for tracking rural consumption, such as consumer non-durables, have performed better than those for urban consumption, such as consumer durables. All these trends have generated the hope that the recovery in the rest of the economy can ride on the resilience of rural India. But economic trends are usually not so simple and linear. Interlinkages between sectors, entities, spillovers, how impulses get transmitted, and a whole lot of dynamics tend to be at play. Growth in one part of the economy can usually not sustain the whole economy. Take, for example, the trend seen since demonetization was rolled out. In many sectors, the formal sector companies benefited as they gained market share. But this has not proved to be beneficial for the overall economy, as it came at the cost of the beleaguered informal sector. Often mistaken as an expansion of the formal part of the economy, this is not organic growth of informal setups into formal businesses. The bigger companies gained market share probably because the informal ones could not survive and became distressed. Similarly, if the rural recovery this time is going to sustain and if it can be relied upon to power the overall economic recovery, becomes a key factor to watch out for going forward. HSBC's chief India economist Pranjal Bhandari, who was earlier a guest on the podcast, had shared good analysis on the prospects of the rural economy. She had said that it is estimated that roughly about 30 million migrant workers returned from urban areas to their homes in villages after the lockdown was announced. The sudden surge in the supply of labor is likely to keep wages in check in rural areas. Therefore, the potential upside in spending will be limited unless wages rise in a lasting way. That will require demand for labor from the construction and real estate sectors to revive. Even pre-COVID, the financial sector's problems had spilled over into the real estate and construction sector, reducing activity. The lockdown has brought construction activity to a near halt, reducing drastically the demand for labor and in turn, in all likelihood, hurting rural wages. The HSBC analysis shows that generally wage rises are driven by economic growth, not the other way around. This is true for both rural and urban wages, since urban construction wages pull up rural wages by attracting the excess labor out of villages. So we must remember that the economy cannot run on just one wheel. The rural economy cannot be expected to tow the load of the entire country. Finally, the point to bear in mind is that the revival may show up in sectors and segments of the economy not being tracked closely so far. That's because the COVID crisis may force fundamental changes in the way the economy works. Every public health crisis in history has led to lasting changes. The New Yorker magazine recently listed some examples. The Black Death reduced the population of medieval Europe to such an extent that labor became scarce and wage rates shot up, weakening the feudal system and in particular the social hierarchy in Britain. The First World War made way for a larger role of women in the economy. The Second World War gave rise to the post-war welfare state in Europe, including the British National Health Service and the adoption of what has come to be known as the Keynesian economic policies. Similarly, the COVID-19 crisis has changed life, attitudes, behaviors, and governance substantially. We must remember that the COVID crisis is unlike anything else seen before. Not even during the Second World War, which plunged the Western world into the Great Depression, had the world economy come to a standstill the way it did in the last few months. Therefore, the current economic situation is truly unprecedented in its scale and depth. It will not be surprising if the changes in the economy it brings about are also very radical. And there's some evidence of this already. In every economic crisis so far, countries have relied on macroeconomic tools of monetary and/or fiscal policy. Those have been found to be ineffective in the present crisis. Despite federal stimulus spending of more than $3 trillion on emergency private wage protection, unemployment assistance, and other forms of relief, the US economy shrank by an annual rate of 32.9% between April and June this year. This is the sharpest contraction in the US GDP since the Second World War. The US has reported a rise in unemployment levels last seen in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Taking never-before monetary policy actions, the US Federal Reserve has injected more than $6 trillion into the US economy through rate cuts, credit and lending programs. And yet, these outcomes. The largest European economy, Germany, saw its growth contract by 10% between April and June, which is the sharpest slump seen in this economy since 1970. This, even after spending more than 130 billion euros on a fiscal stimulus package and slashing tax rates. Dr. Manmohan Singh, a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and one of the best finance ministers India has seen, wrote an article recently in which he highlighted how there are no known policy tools to mitigate the impact of the COVID crisis. In fact, India's case is trickier than that of other economies. The crisis follows a decade of profligate borrowing by the government. The last 5 years had no global economic challenges, but that window was not put to good use for tidying up the mess. Rather, the government's financial management was allowed to deteriorate. Today, the Indian government has little ability to spend like other countries for mitigating the hardships heaped by the virus on the people. Tax collections are down, banks remain buried under mountains of colossal bad debt. The financial system is fragile. Should the debilitating impact of the crisis tip companies or banks into trouble, there's likely to be huge support for large bailouts of private banks, financial institutions, and companies by the taxpayer. These circumstances call for open minds for measuring, tracking, and analyzing and steering the economy through policy. Following old formulations blindly may not work to our advantage. Before closing this episode, let me leave you with a few questions to think about. Is the fact that economies need to evolve and adapt constantly in response to emergent real world situations a good thing or bad? To be able to change is to be alive. Isn't that a comforting thought in times of a raging pandemic? Thank you.